So I think just days after the 2020 election, one of the things that's happening that happens a lot of election cycles is people are rushing to try to explain it, right? Joe Biden won the election, but he won in a way that's somewhat unexpected, maybe by not as much as the polls originally thought. And there might have been movement among some groups that was at least unexpected. So I think what's happening right now is people are kind of rushing to explain things. But the problem is that right after an election is not the period of time when we have all the data we need to really dissect what happened. And these stories that we tell ourselves about the election, these narratives that we form, they're really, really important. They tell the political parties how they succeeded and how they failed. They tell the country itself how it's evolving and how it's changing. So getting these stories right is really important because it helps us make decisions in the future. And the thing I try to tell to everybody is that it's just important to wait. In the same way that it was important to have patience for these vote counts to come in, it's important to wait for these election narratives to be evidence-based and to make sure that they're well-founded. So the exit polls are a long-running study of the American electorate, with the general idea being that you try to canvass people just as they're coming out of a polling place. Now, the methodology of this research has changed over time, right? So more and more people are voting early and they're voting by mail. The exit polls have changed to try to accommodate for that. But generally speaking, it's an attempt to try to actually get people who really voted, who absolutely positively did vote, and ask them how they voted in order to try to tell stories about the American electorate. So historically, one of the problems with the exit polls is that they've tended to get the composition of the electorate wrong. That is to say, historically, there's been too many people who have been white college and not enough people who've been white non-college. And at least one of those problems also appears to be happening in 2020. There just aren't enough white non-college voters in the sample. Now, the reason that we care about this is because that compositional issue tends to ripple throughout the survey. That when they're adjusting these surveys to the final results, that is to say that they're going to adjust all the weighting to try to make it line up with the actual results. If you get the composition of the electorate wrong, it's going to start pushing and pulling parts of the electorate around that it probably doesn't need to push and pull around because you got the composition wrong in the first place. And that's really the big issue with the 2020 election polls and why we should have a little bit of caution about using them to narrativize this election. I think 2020 is going to be a tricky year for this. So I'll be straightforward that I'm being somewhat speculative here, but a lot of our data sources might be affected by the strangeness of COVID-19 and what it's doing to response rates. And it might be affected by how it's even affecting government surveys and how it's affecting surveys writ large, right? So there's all these different pieces of information that we typically use to disentangle an election. And there's at least some reason to believe that the oddities of this year, the high mail-in vote, again, COVID-19, response rates and surveys, these all might make it a bit harder. So, I think while in the past I might have said, give it 6 months, I think this year we need to just be a little more wait and see. I think while there is caution to be had, there's a couple of basic contours of what happened that we can be certain about. So one is that turnout was way up, right? We're going to have an extremely high turnout election. And there's nothing about the surveys or anything that's going to change that result. So that's one thing that we can kind of count on. I think another thing that's reasonably well supported at this point is that there has been somewhat of a shift in the voting behavior of Latinos since 2016. That is to say, they were just a little bit more Republican voting than they were this last election cycle. So I think that's another piece of the puzzle that we need to sort of grapple with. But it is one that, at least right now, appears a little well supported. I think there's a third piece is that there appears to have been a decent amount of split ticket voting. That is to say that people who are voting, how they're voting for president is a little bit different how they might be voting down ballot. And we're just seeing differences in those results that are substantial enough that I think we could probably mark this as a year where a high percentage of that was occurring, or higher, I guess, relative to what's been happening in the recent past. I think getting this right is really important because we're at sort of a pivotal moment in American politics. I think people naturally sense that this was an important election, and therefore narrativizing it is going to be right? Think about what's going to happen within the political parties. They're going to take away lessons from this election, stories about that should determine their future political behavior. And those narratives are really, really important. They're going to decide how those political parties are going to strategize about the future, how they're going to act in the future. So I think for some folks, this can feel like a game. And isn't it interesting to just sort of tell different types of stories about what's happening based on incomplete data? But the truth is that these narratives matter in a way that's really important for our democracy.